Hey everyone, thanks for joining. We're going to give people just a minute or two to get into the room and then we'll get started. All right, so welcome everyone to the first webinar of 2022. I'm Bradley Chalupski, the editor-in-chief and co-founder at merchantfraudjournal.com. And thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited to be able to do this specific topic because we know at the end of the day, this is the one that really matters. Getting back at the fraudsters and winning those chargeback disputes. So we're going to have a really great webinar here. I'm really excited and we'll kick it off right away. So Brittany, why don't you get going here? All right. So like I said, I'm Bradley and we have Brittany Allen, Trust and Safety Architect at Sift with us, and also Alexander Hall, the owner at Dispute Defense Consulting. And they're going to be taking you through everything you need to know to fight and win those January chargeback disputes that we all love to hate. So without further ado, Brittany, take it away.
Absolutely. So thank you all for joining us today in at least what's my first webinar of 2022. Not sure if a few others managed to sneak in. I doubt they did. So I'm glad that you guys have taken the time to join us. We've got 3 topics on our agenda today. First, we're going to talk about the January Chargeback Rush, how it happens every year for e-commerce merchants, but what is different about this year, something we really want to highlight. Then go through what fraud specifically occurs during the holidays, what has happened most this past year, and how we can address that when it comes to fighting those chargeback disputes. But then ending on the really important note of what can we do to prevent chargeback disputes, because we all know fighting true fraud disputes is something extremely difficult, if not impossible to do. So the best case to prevent them is, or the best case to get rid of them is to prevent them. We'll get there though, I'm getting ahead of myself. But for questions, we'll take those at the end. But at any point in time, please feel free to drop your questions in the chat, because I know that you may be able to think of them as we go along, and we'll be able to take a lot of time to address them. I specifically love talking about chargebacks. I've been working chargeback disputes for over a decade in my career as a merchant and then at Sift. So without further ado, the Chargeback Rush. Now this is kind of my wheelhouse here of talking about what has been different versus past years. Now, I, as a merchant, have experienced the January chargeback dispute rush year and year, time and time again. I used to personally call it chargeback hell month, which I think reflects just how much I disliked dealing with those disputes, but it's just part of the nature of, the e-commerce game. If most of your sales are occurring during the holiday period in November and December, then most of your disputes are going to come through in the subsequent months, focusing it on January and trailing off into February. So that's about 1 to 3 months after the time of the transactions, which is general feedback window for getting a chargeback into your system, but it's more spread out this year. I saw a report this morning from MasterCard where they were talking about how there is an 8.5% increase year over year from 2020 to 2021 in the holiday period that they're defining from November 1st through December 24th or Christmas Eve in e-commerce purchases, in online purchases. And that shows a great indication of kind of consumer spending returning to a higher amount, but it being spread out over a holiday season that is starting November 1st instead of the traditional sort of Black Friday, Cyber Monday weekend is a significant call out to make. So in the first screenshot that we've got up here from a news headline from The Guardian talking about global supply chain crisis could last another 2 years, the supply chain and all of the issues therein have definitely been impactful, not only on this year's holiday sales, but also on the subsequent chargebacks. So as we all know, supply chain delays, can lead to product delays, can lead to consumers not getting the items that they ordered in time for Christmas or for other holidays, which of course can lead to disputes. But also, if consumers were aware that they weren't able to get certain items in time for the holidays, it also led to a change in their behavior where they might have been more willing to settle for purchasing alternative items. Unfortunately, some of those alternative items might not have really been what their intended gift recipient, what their, let's say they're giving a gift from a husband to a wife, what their wife really wanted. So we're also looking to see a potential uptick in returns if those alternatives just really didn't land and weren't exactly what that recipient wanted for Christmas. Of course, we know we have more returns. That means potential issues with following return policies, potential frustration from customers, and that of course leads to more chargebacks. So we can see the supply chain affecting chargeback patterns in multiple ways. That then leads me to the middle screenshot from the BBB, or Better Business Bureau, where they found online shopping scams flourished on social media during the pandemic. So I was just talking about how some consumers, when they were maybe unable to buy the thing that they wanted the most to give as a gift over the holidays, turn to alternatives. Well, in some cases, those alternatives would have been posted via social media or maybe other less reputable venues and ended up being scams where the consumer lost their money and did not end up with an item. Now, that would usually focus on some hot items like maybe the PS5 or sort of one of the newest iPhones, whatever it ended up being. That would generally be what those scams would target. And you may think, well, that's not really an issue for me because if they didn't buy it from my website, from my business, me as a merchant, I'm not getting chargebacks because of this money that's lost. In fact, it's very unlikely that these consumers are even able to file chargebacks because they probably didn't pay the fraudster with a credit card. Now, that is absolutely true, but in some cases, they would have gone through a website flow where they would have paid with a credit card. And if they are then able to turn to their bank or their issuing bank and dispute those payments in an attempt to get their money back, that will unfortunately show them the sort of or introduce them to the ease of filing a chargeback dispute. And that's really significant because in Sift's Q4 Trust and Safety Index report, which we released a few weeks ago, and we focused in on chargebacks as our primary topic, we found via a consumer survey that of people who have filed chargeback disputes, 86% of people are then willing to or believe they will be likely to file a dispute again in the future. So once a consumer has filed a dispute and worked with their credit card company to get their money back, they're more likely to try to do that again. At least 86% of people are likely to try it again. So that's a pretty good indication that it's a process that works for consumers and that they're not looking to, move away from once they've had success there. So if people are scammed and they are paying with their credit cards in those instances and they are able to get recourse, they may be more likely, unfortunately, to turn to chargebacks when they're having an issue with a legitimate merchant. And that last screenshot here, Senate grills airline execs over refund complaints. Boy, returns and refunds have really been a hot topic over the past, I guess I should say 2 years. I went from saying past year for 2020 to past 18 months. Now I'll just say past 2 years for the pandemic itself. But I want you to think about for your business where your policies were regarding returns and refunds during the course of the holiday season, maybe even a little bit before, and where they are now. How were those policies potentially changed based on any supply chain issues or other problems that your business encountered? And most importantly, when they changed, how were they shared with consumers? How do you know that you have the consumers having opted in and agreed to those return and refund policies? And where do you have records to prove that for the evidence that you would use to submit in response to any chargeback disputes you may receive, such as credit not processed or any other refund and return related complaints. Unfortunately, I've seen a lot of merchants who would make certain policy decisions but weren't able to do that sort of dynamic tracking so that they could indicate which transactions were covered under which particular version of a policy. And that can be something that I foresee being a bigger issue when we are looking back on these January 2022 disputes in a few months after they've all rolled in. So that then brings me to the idea of, well, how are we going to prioritize working chargeback disputes? From the same Q4 Digital Trust and Safety Index that Sift ran, we found that we found that the average number of daily chargeback cases rose by 19% between Q1 2020 and Q1 2021. So all said and done, if we look back on last year, what did we see? We saw an increase in chargeback disputes year over year from 2020 to 2021. Because of the increase in online purchases, like I mentioned with the MasterCard statistic earlier, I don't see any reason why we wouldn't also continue to see an increase in chargeback disputes, because those go hand in hand with the volume of e-commerce sales. So if we're then going to be sort of focused on prioritizing disputes, we can go quite a few different directions, but I wanted to be able to share some tips with you all today. And I've focused on these under the categories of chargeback profile, internal data and strategy, and also your own business needs. Again, I've given trainings before on prioritizing disputes where that topic alone can take up an entire hour, and I have a pretty robust reference deck that goes along with it, but I hope that I'll be able to touch on some points that are helpful for you all today. So let's start with chargeback profile. What I mean by that is just the nature of the chargeback, whether it's the reason code, plus other indicators within your system, but basically that profile of this chargeback represents this type of either consumer complaint or this type of fraud. And I've given two examples here. So if you're, let's say, having thousands of chargeback disputes a month, you have a pretty high volume of disputes. There's ways that you can sort and prioritize them as they come in. One being, is this the first fraudulent chargeback dispute from a long-time active customer? So this might be a situation where you could either be looking at a potential for account takeover. We'll get to some of those other signals as we move on to the next category, but you could also be looking here at a legitimate, let's say, merchant error or service complaint. But it's very important to know what the customer history is and what the chargeback history is for the individuals in your system as those chargebacks are coming in related to their accounts. Second of all, I've got a dispute with no cardholder documentation, supporting details, and generalized reason code, i.e. one of the chargebacks that I hated to see the most when it came through with no notes, no info, and the reason code general. If you are forced with thousands of chargeback disputes to make prioritization decisions, those might be the ones where you don't ignore them, but you, let's say, automate them. You have an automated response set up so that you do not have to have some individual doing more research or taking more time, and you're able to save that agent time for higher priority disputes. That could be a great way to balance this situation out for chargeback profile. So getting into a little more detail, let's talk about internal data and strategy. So we've got the first bullet point here of looking at transaction risk, event scoring, and prior fraud decisioning. So let's say you have 500 chargebacks that have come through in a month with the reason code fraud. And let's say you use a fraud prevention system, perhaps similar to Sift, where you're able to have that transaction risk assessed at the time of checkout, and you're able to refer back to it. If it came with a, let's say, quite risky score or a quite risky assessment, then there's more likelihood that that fraud chargeback is an actual true fraud dispute. But let's say that it ties back more to that first chargeback profile of being from a long-time customer and there's no indication of risk within this disputed transaction. That would be one where I would prioritize the response. So looking sort of dynamically at that range of risk and then focusing in on the ones that were assessed as lower risk as the ones that if I represent them, I've probably got a better chance of fighting them because there's a higher likelihood that they're not true fraud. The second bullet point there is on customer communication. There's a lot of strategies for customer communication with chargebacks. I've worked for one company where when a chargeback dispute was received on our end, we sent an automated email to the customer asking them about the dispute. And we got a just variation of responses from ones that were really helpful to ones that weren't as helpful, but getting any response at all, A, was something that I could put in my representment document and send back to the issuer, but B, did give me more detail and was allowed me to then prioritize which disputes should be focused on. So customer communication is great to have. And then lastly, I just listed customer account attributes such as IP, the date of the latest password change. Those are things that'll be very helpful for you to prioritize your disputes. Again, an account that hasn't had much variance in its IP address used to access it, hasn't had any sort of suspicious account updates, but the chargeback comes through with the fraud reason code, more of a likelihood that you'll be able to successfully represent that dispute. And lastly, and this is probably the broadest category of variance for all of our attendees today, but we've got business needs. So what do you within your business need to do to focus in on your priorities and your goals? Is there potentially a way that you can prioritize disputes by the value of the chargeback dispute? Some merchants have very narrow variances in their average order value. Others can have very wide variances. So you don't want to then let those high value disputes sit there and languish. Maybe you want to prioritize those. Also, order fulfillment status. If you're getting a chargeback dispute on an item that's back ordered and hasn't shipped out, there's no reason to let that sit there. That should be an order that is canceled, that is cut off. You can see how that would be very beneficial. Also, if you are let's say, hotel website, if it's an upcoming future stay, or if you're an airline and it's a flight, again, those are all things where if it's not fulfilled, you can prevent as much loss as possible by prioritizing those disputes to be worked. Then I've got customer account designation. I really like to call out this one for prioritizing disputes. Do you have any kind of VIP flagging within your system? As in, are they at the top tier of a loyalty point program? Or have you actually identified them as, being a potential VIP if you work with celebrity or celebrity adjacent accounts? Any way you slice it, those are accounts that you shouldn't let sit because they are likely to need a white glove customer support interaction. And you can actually achieve that. And I've actually built some processes for a few different companies on how to make the chargeback process white glove for VIP accounts. That's definitely something that you can accomplish. And then last, I hate to bring it up, but if you are either at risk of being put into a chargeback monitoring program or your business is already in one, that will absolutely be what you need to prioritize. So if you're being monitored by Visa, you absolutely need to be on top of all of your Visa disputes. If it is within a specific geography, let's say, well, I won't call out the specific example from my past, but I have had it before where for a processor within a specific currency, we were in a monitoring program. So that then prioritized what I would focus on, that currency within that processor for any disputes that came in. You can see where that's going. Hopefully you haven't experienced that yourself, but if you have, that is the way that you would prioritize those disputes. Now, a lot of what I just said focused mostly on non-fraud or friendly fraud, but some chargebacks will unfortunately be due to true fraud because some fraud will get through your fraud prevention system. And with that, to talk about the fraud holiday schemes, I'm going to turn it over to Alexander.
Thank you so much. That was really insightful. I was taking notes over here. That was really fun. So hi, everybody. Thank you guys for carving out some time to be with us today. There are some new ways that fraudsters are getting through to systems, and I think it's very important, as Brittany mentioned, to get on the prevention of fraud. So yeah, I'm here to talk about the main methods that I personally know take off during the holiday season, right? So the first one here that we have is traditional card not present fraud. So this is the one that everyone is most familiar with, but it definitely takes off during the holiday season. So to describe this, we're going to say that it's the fraudster that uses stolen payment information in order to make a transaction. Now, the ways that the variables that go into this can take place at different touch points across the customer journey. And we're going to get into that whenever we talk about identifying these trends. But typically what you're going to see is you're going to see that it's stolen information, which means that it's not verified against the past billing information. The shipping address matches a shipping address that is local to the fraudster, meaning that they're going to deliver it to a drop house. They might deliver it to their address. It's going to be unassociated to the recorded billing information. The third step there is maybe it gets sent over to the billing address, but then it gets intercepted by porch pirates. It might get stolen. It might get stolen after it's delivered, right? So that's the traditional way. With buy now, pay later, the process has been changed. So what happens is when a merchant employs this or offers it to their customers, what happens is the information gets verified secondarily. So the fraudster might be using identity information to create an account there, and then the payment, the checkout goes through the merchant and sent off to the third party, the actual service provider for BNPL. When that happens, the service provider accepts the payments for the order in different installments, and the liability gets shifted to them. The reason why this is important is because the payment information isn't being submitted to the merchant, meaning the verification isn't being done by the merchant. The difficulty comes in whenever the chargeback comes in for any of the payments, because then the merchant has to use the information that was not verified in order to support the chargebacks that come in to the service provider. The next one is whenever we deal with holiday rule set exploits. And that's going to be whenever it becomes normal for a shipping address to not be associated with billing information, because you're going to be sending gifts to people that are maybe across the country or in different places. And the second part to that is going to be the social engineering aspect, whereas an order might get placed and then the customer might call in and try to ask for the order to be redirected. So those are the three ways that I think that fraudsters are going to be attacking different merchants.
Yeah.
Go to the next one.
Yeah, because we can sum that up basically as for traditional CNP fraud, what happens every year, what's evergreen, what will never go away. For buy now, pay later, what is hot or what is increasing in use this year. And then holiday rule exploits, what they know merchants have to do in order to be able to handle the increased volume over the holidays. So it's three really, really good designations that now we're at the point where Alex and I are going to do a little discussion back and forth based around at least 1 point for each of these. So what I brought up for traditional CNP fraud is the question of, when you're reviewing your orders, when you're looking over your transactions, are you verifying the identity or an identity? It's a really important designation, because if a fraudster is savvy enough to be able to buy a good full record of PII to be able to then use on your website to make purchases, to buy healthy, stolen or phished accounts, and all of the information that they use passes a verification or a review process, that still won't do you any good when you get to the actual chargeback dispute that comes through afterward, because in that instance, the credit card company is only going to care about documentation that proves the cardholder's involvement and not the, let's say, customer themselves. And if the cardholder's information belongs to Brittany Allen, but the account information was all set up by Alexander Hall, potentially under a completely different and fake name, they're not going to care about any of that information that doesn't relate back to Brittany Allen actually being involved in this purchase and making this purchase. So I know there's a couple of different strategies for being able to verify that identity, but I want to pause here before I do my usual of just talking too much and turn it back over to Alex.
So when it comes to an effective fraud prevention strategy, I am a definite advocate for leveraging PII information, expansive PII information, to do exactly what Brittany just outlined. Verify the identity associated with the payment information instead of verifying that an identity is real, right? Or at least is being used appropriately. So whenever it comes down to it, all of the methods that you encounter, all of the fraudster methods that you encounter along your journey as a merchant can all use expansive PII in order to answer this question. So let's move to the next bullet.
Yeah. Oh, but before we move on, I just had something that popped into my head. No, this is going to keep happening. I will randomly remember something at the very last second. But I was having a discussion with a merchant just the other day about, well, that's great if you're using that kind of information to be able to identify patterns of fraud, but what about when it comes to privacy legislation, such as GDPR and CCPA, where if there are data deletion requests submitted, of course, the merchant has to comply with them. And then maybe you actually don't have the information as easily accessible as you might need within your system to make those comparisons or those queries, or potentially it is a data retention issue where you know that you can't go back over a year or over 2 years to look at some year-over-year patterns. So in those cases, I just wanted to highlight, especially for any newer merchants within the room, if you aren't already working with either your compliance or your legal team to be aware of what all of those data retention policies are and data deletion request policies are, make sure that you're doing so, because there are ways to then still retain certain pieces of information for fraud prevention that is written in to the language of GDPR. And there are still therefore ways for you to leverage just exactly what Alex was describing while still complying with privacy regulations, which I believe will only continue to, roll out and be applied around the world as we go on.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And I just actually came across a service provider for the first time who focuses on people who have these PII requirements and compliance requirements in mind. And that was, I don't know, should I mention them? Can I mention them? Because I think it's a good suggestion to throw out there. It's Identic. Mm-hmm. They focus on really keeping the information in a black box in order to help different merchants maintain those compliance things. So yeah, that was something I wanted to mention.
You're going to make me get up on my soapbox about how I can't wait until we're all back to normal with in-person conferences, because that is where you get to walk the floor of the exhibit hall and you get to actually see what options are available to you as a merchant. And it really helps open your eyes to what is out there that will help you with your fraud prevention goals.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. Buy now, pay later.
So with buy now, pay later, as I mentioned in the last slide, the method here is kind of chopped up because the responsibilities are set between the service provider and the merchant. And when it comes to identifying the fraud on the front end, when I was speaking to a lot of different service providers, what I found was, because this is a new system, it seems like there's a lot of troubleshooting that's going on with BNPL in order to identify what true fraud is as it comes in. And so it's important for the merchant to understand that there is a certain responsibility on them to verify as much information as possible prior to the payment information being submitted to the service provider in that third-party setting. And so that's why, again, this is where the PII for me comes up. And I feel it's a tool that can be leveraged very heavily because as the account gets created, as the associated data points get put into the system in order for the checkout process to begin, there's a lot of information that you can leverage in order to support anything that might be happening secondarily with the payment part. So what I mean by that is, when a customer first visits the website, they're going to be visiting from an IP address. Depending on the device fingerprinting that you have available to you, you might be able to get a hold of a device ID. You might be able to see geolocation. In addition to that, you might see a phone number and email address, and you'll be able to take those data points and cross-reference them against past occurrences and past data across a merchant network or across a global network in order to verify that information before the transaction ever takes place. So recently, that's one thing that I'm suggesting to different clients who are using BNPL is to do your due diligence as early as possible, and expanding your data points to include more PII, because again, the payment information isn't coming into your system, it's going into the service provider system.
Yeah, as we talked about before this webinar even started, Alex and I were chatting, and there are merchants who have been either restricted and limited by payment processors or completely cut off by them due to having too much fraud activity, having their fraud rates be, kind of out of control. And the same thing goes with BNPL providers. If there's too much fraud or liability for your business going through their system, even though they may have built into their contract with you a shift where they do take on responsibility for fraud, they could also then decide to cut those ties or to increase fees. There can be consequences still for having fraud go through those systems. And a lot of the monitoring that I've been doing over the past few weeks on fraud forums, specifically on Telegram, shows that the fraudsters are very talkative and very chatty about buy now, pay later programs, whether that is about selling accounts that have been stolen through them, or whether that's about setting up new accounts to leverage stolen payment methods, or even a few other strategies that don't have time to get into today, but allow them to sort of do a policy abuse attack via these providers. In the end, that also reflects the fact that you as a merchant then will be selling merchandise to a customer who does not have good lifetime value for your business, who is not going to come back and be a loyal, repeat, valuable customer. And then that just means that you're having marketing spend and a lot of other spend that unfortunately is not going to growing your business in the way that you intend. And so even if it doesn't result in a chargeback, that it can still be a really detrimental hit to your business.
Mm-hmm.
And then holiday rule set exploits. So what I've added here is the question of how does your business implement internal admin permission levels? Because I loved that on sort of the prior version of this slide, Alexander had called out social engineering. Social engineering is leveraged against merchants day in and day out, and very often via the call center or via the customer service wing of your business. So is your customer service team, first of all, aware of what the risks are for social engineering? I used to, at one company I worked for, run, I think it was about a quarterly or maybe twice a year training on social engineering with customer service, just to even make them aware of the potential that every person who calls them is not telling the truth and should not get what they want, because that can be very much a customer service mindset. Which then leads me to, when I talk about internal admin permissions, do you have any kind of tiering or protections within your system where certain employees are unable to make changes that other employees are able to make? So an example being, if your trust and safety team, let's say, cancels an order or closes an account due to fraud, is your customer service team able to overturn or reinstate a replacement order or issue a credit to that customer? Or I shouldn't even say customer, to that fraudster? Or are there those tiering and protections in place where that kind of social engineering attack isn't going to be successful because they aren't going to be able to reach the individuals who actually do have the permissions? This is something that you can be tiering internally. It's also something that you can put within your fraud prevention system, but it's both important and vital to have the awareness and education around social engineering to prevent these purchases that can turn into chargebacks, and then also just put those practical barriers in place so that fraudsters don't learn that social engineering will work via your customer service channel. Yeah. I don't think Alex has anything to add there. Hopefully he's not taking notes.
I wasn't sure if you were taking a breath or not. I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. Oh, that's hard to tell with me. I am taking a full official breath if there's anything you wanted to add.
Yeah, when it comes to the holiday rule sets, the thing that I was familiar with in the past was putting in an order that would make it through the chargeback or through the checkout process. And for example, imagine a fraudster goes in with a stolen set of information and puts in, they have an accurate set of information, and they put in the right billing address, the right shipping address, and everything checks out during checkout. But then secondarily, as Brittany mentioned, they call the customer service line and they say, hey, this order went through, but I need to change the shipping information. Well, if your customer service team has the ability to make that change without the ability to verify the request, that can lead to a lot of problems. And that's going to be really hard to defend in the after when the chargeback hits. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And at that same level with permissions, if they can then see that they are unable to make that change, you also don't want to have so much information surface to those teams where they read to the fraudster over the phone. Yeah, it looks like your order is actually, I can't make that change because you recently blah, 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 blah. Like you recently, changed your IP address or you recently did this. We don't want to give those indicators away to how we caught fraudsters. So there's a lot of thought that can go into this that can help stop whatever allowances or dealings that you need to do to deal with the very high volume of holiday sales from being something that fraudsters can just take and abuse.
Right. Absolutely. Yep.
So to keep it moving, we're now going to dive into leveraging data for chargeback prevention. And Alex, this is yours.
So this, what you see on screen is the 4-step strategy development process that I've created when I work with merchants. The 4 steps are identify, monitor, automate, and repeat. So drilling down on the first one, identifying your transfers of value. Now, what I mean by that is a fraud prevention strategy should consider different types of engagements with different customers. Of course, we're going to talk about the checkout process, and of course, the sale is important. But as we've been mentioning over the course of this webinar, we're also going to be talking about the power that customer service has to make changes to orders. We're going to talk about, promotions and discounts, abuse. We can talk about lines of credit. You can talk about the simple ability to create accounts. All of these engagements and interactions are considered, to me, transfers of value because every single one has value, which means fraudsters might target them. So the first step with discovering fraud for me is to identify each and every one that that your operation offers, right? The second one, monitor. By implementing new pieces of data in your system and monitoring them, you're going to be able to see which ones are being attacked, and you'll also be able to see when attacks start to roll in. If you don't have data in the right places, you won't have that answer. And then you're just shooting in the dark in order to figure out what to do about it when they come in. The third step, automate. Once you have the data and you start to understand what losses are coming into your system and you start to understand what the effect of fraud has been, you then can start searching for an automation process or a service provider who automates the different processes in fraud prevention. And then the last step is repeat. As your company grows, you're going to outgrow certain software. You're going to start offering new things. You're going to start offering new types of engagements. Maybe you start rolling into it the buy now, pay later, or maybe you start offering in-house credit. All of these are examples of outgrowing systems or expanding, and therefore you need to start all over again. You start to see where these vulnerabilities might be with each one, how to process it, put data in place, and the cycle just continues. Fraud is ever evolving, right? It's never done. So it's always good to stay ahead of the curve.
Absolutely. And I'm going to be following up on pretty much, I think, the monitor and automate section here. But of course, that is preceded by identify, and repeat is always on the end. So I think what I'm going to say is only going to support Alex's approach. But I wanted to show this example from a real document that I made when I was a merchant, looking at chargeback disputes that we were really dealing with in that year, to show you an idea of how I would analyze chargeback disputes. And this graph right here represented what I labeled as disputes to date non-fraud. So by non-fraud, I just meant anything that wasn't true fraud. I was lumping together friendly fraud and service and merchant error disputes. But the point of this graph was so that I could communicate with the higher ups within our company about what the reason code breakdown for chargebacks looked like for these transactions that I had identified as not being the result of true fraud. And as you can see here, over half of them still had the reason code of fraudulent. I'm sure that's not a surprise to many people in the room, and I'm sure that you see similar breakdowns when analyzing your own chargeback disputes. Unfortunately, when it comes to how consumers are able to dispute payments, sometimes choosing fraud is the simplest way for them to get their money back and for them to be able to, get that resolution that they want. And so they turn to that reason code instead of the actual reason code around their complaint, because, hey, maybe they actually don't have a valid complaint. Maybe they missed the return window. Maybe they otherwise didn't comply with some policies, and that's what they're going to do to get their money back. So I would use this visualization of our analysis of the disputes to then, for example, prove to the higher ups why we couldn't just ban every account that files a fraud reason code chargeback, because it must be an account takeover and it must be the result of fraud, to be able to show them what actually we could do with the data. And this just is one example of how I would do that. Now, of course, this really depends on a lot of other factors within your business, such as your reporting capability. Are you able to pull reports from all of your processors? Are you able to look at them within a centralized place, such as a chargeback management software or other system that you have built up, and you're able to pull from all of your merchant IDs? And then at the same time, separate by those factors so that you can follow any particular trends and stay on top of any risks that you see with, let's say, having too much fraud coming through a particular venue. Also, are you able to look at some updates dynamically about the status of your chargeback disputes? That's something really imperative to being able to analyze them. Do you know if they're still pending? Are they closed won? Are they closed loss? Or are they moving on to a second dispute or pre-arbitration? Being able to keep track of that dynamically really supports that ability to analyze chargebacks, because otherwise you're just in a spreadsheet, you're manually updating the status of disputes based on getting an email from a processor or getting a letter in the mail, which is my absolute least favorite. Oh, actually, no, I take that back. Since we've all been working from home, I think my least favorite is fax, because I literally cannot get one of those. So that's my least favorite. But being able to see that dynamically and get the idea of how much money have you won back, how much have you lost, and how much is still in play really will support your ability to analyze. And then, of course, to find patterns by bank, by issuer, by reason code. I call those out again with the idea of prioritizing your chargeback disputes, especially if you have a high volume of disputes. I was able to find in the past that a standardized template that we had put together, let's say for item not received, would work really well across multiple issuing banks, but then fail at one. And I know which one it is, and I'm not going to say it, but I want to say it really badly because they would drive me crazy. But we would then take our time to try to redo and improve the template for that issuer to see if we can get that issuer's win rate up to then give us overall lift to the win rate for item not received disputes. And if we hadn't analyzed our chargebacks and looked for patterns based on issuing bank or BIN even, we wouldn't have been able to come up with that need and to identify it. So one example that I can share from the work that I do at Sift working with customers is right now I'm working with one of our clients that uses our dispute management or basically chargeback solution, and they are looking to implement same-day delivery. And they are curious about what their risks are, not only for fraud, but also what do they need to have available for answering disputes, because this will be the first time they're working with a third-party delivery service to complete that last mile delivery. There's a lot more variables in play that they just haven't dealt with before as a business. And so I'm going to be meeting with them and helping them walk through that process. And I'm going to be basing basically all my knowledge on having looked at chargebacks for other merchants, but then also looking at what their current chargebacks and fraud patterns are. And we'll only be able to improve and sort of hone in on the best response strategy for them based on having all of that data in front of us and having that reliable, sort of robust reporting at our fingertips. Now, beyond that very human effort focused analysis, there is also the need to be able to do something at scale, which always is going to involve using machine learning or, using that kind of assistance and that big data approach. So for this, I want to call out an example of high volume digestible data ingestion, which is a title that I have to pause while saying to make sure I don't stumble over any of those words. But basically the idea, again, going back to using your internal data for prioritizing disputes, what can we learn from the patterns of both fraud on your website and from the chargebacks that make it through? And what can we do to prevent those in the future or identify which ones we might be able to have the best chance of representing? This particular example here goes through some options for how a user may log in or access your website, whether it's a social login, a direct login, or coming from an ad on Google. I have in the past, while working for one merchant, seen an enormous spike in one particular social media login that we later learned was due to a data breach within that social media platform. And it then was pretty clear, and we got notice even before they made that data breach public, that all of those particular logins were due to fraud. And we were able to then, stop any kind of order activity within those accounts. Whereas normally just having a social media login for a new account would not have been a heads up that there was an immediate risk of fraud. But because we were able to look at our very, very high volume, because this was a large company that I work for, of data and find those patterns, it's extremely beneficial. Here at Sift, we talk about how we've got 16,000, unique signals a month at any point in time that we're looking at. It's not 16,000 signals per each merchant, but it's still something that we're able to look at globally. And that's just a scale that requires machine learning and goes beyond human effort. So make sure that that is something that you're at least considering and potentially prioritizing for your chargeback strategy. So with that, we've got about 15 minutes left, and I know I saw questions coming in while I was speaking. So I think now is a good time for us to end on some high-level takeaways and then go straight into questions. So our takeaways for this webinar were: 1, focus your representment efforts on friendly fraud disputes. True fraud is not the kind of dispute that you will be able to win, but it is what you should be looking to learn from within your chargebacks and then prevent. 2, use learnings from true fraud disputes to improve your fraud prevention strategy. And 3, analyze your chargeback data to complete that feedback loop and be able to send information from chargebacks back to the frontline trust and safety teams that can then implement that to prevent more chargebacks from coming through. So with that, I think I can stop and we can start going through questions.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much for that extremely informative presentation. It's really great to be able to see such actionable advice and see the theory and the execution put together. Was really great. So thank you for that. First question here we have is, are there any ways you found to effectively deal with package not received, especially with the COVID trend where FedEx and UPS will not collect a signature even when requested and will simply mark it as COVID and leave it for porch bandits to grab?
Yeah, I can start answering that one. I know that that is a big struggle, especially if you have a logistics unit within your company that establishes those contracts with the different delivery providers, whether it's FedEx or UPS or whomever, and you may have added in, to your contract different provisions around, what happens if signature is required but not accepted. So those are things, or not collected. Those are instances where you may be able to make claims through your logistics team. I know that will take other effort within your company. And if you don't have a logistics team that you can make those claims through for loss prevention, then that leaves you just trying to improve your win rate with the chargeback disputes themselves. So if you're seeing it's just If it's just a situation of porch piracy, which by that you mean the customer is a trustworthy customer from beginning to end, and then they were victimized at a point that is completely outside of your control, unfortunately, that falls more into a cost of doing business. And hopefully, that's not something that is hitting your business at scale. It's just something that, as the opportunity presents itself to the porch pirates and they're able to get a box here and there, you will get these legitimate reports from customers who are telling the truth. What you should be looking at, and this comes to sort of the broader question of looking at data at a higher level, is being able to find individuals who are falsely reporting that their items were stolen from their porch. This can fall under the refund fraud umbrella. And if you find those repeatable patterns, I know that there have been some strategies that are used by different retailers. And we probably don't have too much time. I know we have quite a few questions to get into refund fraud itself, but I will leave the answer to that question with being identifying those patterns and separating out customers who have a great lifetime value and are trustworthy customers, and unfortunately just having to give them refunds from those who may be making false statements about those situations, and then addressing those in a different manner.
All right. So next question. Why should there be different templates for different banks? And what is the main information that banks are looking at when they make a decision on chargebacks that come with fraudulent reason codes? And what proof can you provide to actually successfully win these disputes?
Okay, so I may ask you to repeat part of that question to make sure I hit all 3 points. But for the first one, why different templates for different issuing banks? Yes, you want to make your templates as scalable as possible, and you don't want to have sort of a never-ending bevy of options that are in front of you, but you will find that it can be beneficial to customize language per, let's say, the card networks based on what language they use, so that their agents who are trained to handle the rules of their particular card network can then recognize the validity of the information you've submitted and know what's in front of them. It's pretty commonly quoted, and I do believe it's true, that most agents answering chargeback disputes on behalf of issuing banks have about 30 seconds to a minute to look at one case, if not a shorter amount of time. And the more quickly they can recognize that the merchant understands what needs to be submitted and has submitted the correct, compelling evidence, then the more there is a likelihood that it will be ruled in the merchant's favor. So if you find there are language differences, or if you find that there are approaches that work for one particular network over the other, you'll want to make those changes to your templates. And when it comes down to issuing banks, that was something that we thankfully were able to work with our processor on, and they actually had some formatting recommendations. And it can all just come down to what the view looks like on the on that issuing bank side. Are they able to see the documents in color? Can they only see black and white? What is the image compression? How useful is it even to include an image in your response? Because can they actually see it, or does it just like a blur to them? There's a lot that is pretty detailed that you can go into with that documentation. And now that I've said that out loud, Bradley, I forgot the second part of the question. Could you remind me?
Sure. No, I mean, I think you covered most of it.
Okay.
The rest of the question was really just asking what you could actually do to win these types of disputes, which you've pretty much covered. So,
got it.
Next question. Do you have any advice on how to win more pre-arbitrations?
Oof. Be very careful when you enter into pre-arbitration. I think in my career, I've only done it a handful of times. And I will admit a few of those were sort of like playing chicken with the card holder to see if they would also be willing to go into that process. I'm not too proud of those moments, but it happens. It's very difficult to win pre-arbitration as a merchant because you are required to provide new evidence. If you do not have new evidence to provide, there is no reason to enter pre-arb. If you do have new evidence, make sure that when you are submitting your documentation to enter pre-arbitration, you specifically and clearly highlight what is the new evidence within your response. So it becomes clear that you're complying with that rule. If you're not doing that, I could see why you're having more difficulty with the pre-arb process. But it all just comes down to pick your battles very carefully. There is a hefty fee for losing arbitration, and make sure that you have made it clear to the issuing bank what your new evidence is and why it's worth submitting and looking at. And if you need tips on how to get new evidence, I always find that continued outreach to the cardholder, and whether they respond or not, if you can show that they opened the email at the very least, such as if you're able to see that in Salesforce, showing that continued attempt at outreach usually will check the box for that new evidence. So that's at least one thing to consider.
All right. And then we have one more question here. It's any suggestions on how to deal with recurring order free trials being charged back as fraud?
Ooh. All right. Since I've been talking a lot, Alex, is there anything that you want to bring up from the fraud angle for abuse of free trials?
So the way that used to, I don't know how to answer this one specifically, but I can tell you how the way that I'm familiar with it working in the past, and hopefully we'll be able to work something through for that. There were several different service providers out in the world who offered free trials, and those types of settings, their information, or I'm sorry, their trials would be used as a way to check credit card information. The fraudster would check different sets of credit card information by signing up for free trials. For a fraudster, this is important because then they can start to discern what service providers require what pieces of information. So with that, it's kind of difficult to predict what's going to go on, because say, for example, it's a free trial that doesn't require CVV or billing information like the zip code or billing address. It doesn't verify those pieces of information. Well, the fraudster can generate long lists of credit card numbers and test them against that system. So to the merchant or to the service provider, it looks like it's coming in from just all over the place, and there's no trend to identify. And so with that, I would suggest increasing the requirements on signing up for these free trials. If all you require is credit card number and an expiration date, like a few service providers have in the past, maybe increase that, and that'll lower the rate for fraud entering your system. Now, if you already are doing that and you have expansive billing information being verified, maybe look at the different types of rules that you have in place when they're being automated to be approved. Yeah, that's really what I can think of.
Yeah, and I can come on the heels of that to say, when it comes to looking at your policies for free trials, I know a lot of marketing teams really aren't excited about sharing or making clear with customers what the process is or their rights to end a free trial are, to then avoid being charged on the next month if it's a 1 month free trial. But that is really, really vital to being able to win, let's say, subscription billing chargeback disputes, because having those easily viewable and fully disclosed and transparent terms made clear to the cardholder, having a reminder sent to them via email that there is an upcoming charge and that they can opt out by doing this step, not having those steps hidden, and not having the steps to opt out of a charge be any more full of friction than the actual sign up process itself was. For example, if you can sign up for the free trial online, but you then can only cancel before you're charged via the phone, that is not going to go over well with the card networks, and you are probably going to lose more disputes because you don't have that easy pathway to allow the customer to opt out. So you can optimize your policies or your processes to try to make the chargeback dispute risk from free trials drop down. And you can still work with your marketing teams and with your product team to show them that, you're not here as a revenue killer. You are very excited to support the business. You want to see high numbers for signups. You want to see high numbers for conversion, but you also don't want to see high numbers for losses.
All right. Amazing information. Thank you guys so much. Thanks everyone for joining us. We will be sending out copies of the webinar in the coming days, so you can make sure to listen to this again. A lot of information taken at once. Thank you, Brittany. Thank you, Alex, for joining us. And yeah, you can get all the great insights on merchantfraudjournal.com. And thanks again, guys.